Hello, YouTube and YouTubettes. This is part two of my wrestling discussion. And in part one, I talked about my first time that I was interested and got into wrestling, which was 2002 to 2004 of SmackDown. And then I got bored by it. Well, in 2011, I decided to try to get back into it. And at first, it was quite boring. I had no idea who most of these people were. There were some familiar faces, John Cena, Randy Orton, which I think I'd seen in the first time I watched. Undertaker and Kane were around. Mark Henry and Big Show. So there were some familiar faces, but then there was a lot of new faces. And it was quite boring at first. One of the first things I saw was Santino Marella and I think some Russian dude were trolling Sheamus. And I was watching it kind of, I don't know, but we'll see. Maybe I'll get into these new characters. And at first, quite a while it was kind of boring. But I was aware that I was coming into this cold. I didn't know the background or the storylines that were happening. I just kind of jumped into the middle of it. Well, some of the first intriguing things that happened in this time, there were two heel turns, Mark Henry and R-Truth. And Mark Henry, who was the strongest man in the world, kept losing matches and finally just blew up and just started throwing everything around and became, this big monster heel. And he became a really good heel. Before that, he was just kind of smiling, strong man that always lost. And the other one was R-Truth. And over the next several months, he became my favorite character on the show with Little Jimmy, if you remember that. I loved that character. And in my mind, I thought, what if he starts a tag team with Little Jimmy and the other tag teams start to just flop around like this invisible wrestler is throwing them around or whatever. But that didn't happen. But I really enjoyed R-Truth's gimmick. So at this time, I was actually watching both Raw and SmackDown, and I figured out somewhere along the way that the face of Raw was John Cena and the face of SmackDown was Randy Orton, and I kind of learned that those were the two big stars of the show at this time. And John Cena bored me. He just seemed like an everyman. He was the smiling, good-looking, good guy, and I was more interested in kind of the weird characters like R-Truth, and even Randy Orton was pretty interesting to me. He seemed like an evil guy, but as a baby face. So that made it kind of interesting as well. So some of the other characters that stuck out to me, obviously I always enjoyed Undertaker and Kane and Big Show because I had memories of them and they were larger than life, 7-footers, But along the way, I mentioned R-Truth. Mark Henry was another one as a heel I really started to enjoy. Wade Barrett and his feud with Randy Orton, and I remember they had this like a street fight, three falls anywhere match, and they had a good feud. Sheamus began to develop into, now he was losing every time early on, but he began to win everything, and he was a heel, and he then wanted to man up and face Mark Henry, and that was his face turn, and I really enjoyed Sheamus. Alberto Del Rio, which sort of reminded me of Eddie Guerrero in the sense of the entrance, like coming in a sports car, but Alberto Del Rio had a bit more of a highbrow, kind of attitude, like I'm richer than you, whereas Eddie Guerrero seemed like the guy on the streets, but they were both kind of this, coming in with these cars and everything, but Del Rio seemed like a perfect heel to me. Then there was, I remember Daniel Bryan seemed very boring, clean cut, small guy, so I didn't think much of him. CM Punk, the same thing at first, just this small guy that was part of a group, and I really didn't know much of the history of him. But then it was intriguing when he did his pipe bomb. And of course, this is one of the the memories, one of the greatest moments in a wrestling show, where he sat up there and started to talk about how John Cena was, kiss the A of Vince McMahon, and, saying how he was being held down and all this stuff, and he was the best. And this was probably the first time I began to appreciate the promo, although I did like the R-Truth gimmick and all that. I liked characters and I liked good in-ring stuff. But at this point, I realized, okay, this guy can talk. This guy's a good promo guy. And also, it sounded like it made me wonder if this was actually scripted, because then his mic got cut off. So I became intrigued by that story. And I'll take this moment to say that the wrestling that I began to enjoy in 2011, as I was getting back into it and trying to get back into it, by this point, by the middle of 2011, I think I started to really enjoy the shows. And it was a completely different style of show than it was in 2002 to 2004. The SmackDown of that era was more about the wrestling, and not there wasn't much outside of the ring that stuck in my head other than the entrances of Undertaker and Kane. Most of my memorable moments were in-ring stories being told, and in this case, in 2011, I realized it was more about storytelling and characters, and there was other aspects of it that I began to appreciate. Now, some of it did remind me of SmackDown 2002 to 2004, such as the Randy Orton Wade Barrett feud, the Sheamus Mark Henry feud, and things, and Big Show was involved in that as well. So there was a lot of stuff like that that was a bit more SmackDown-ish. Kind of these violent matches and characters, and that kind of a thing. But there was new things that I began to enjoy. The R-Truth Little Jimmy thing was unlike anything I remember ever seeing in 2002 to 2004. And then what CM Punk, his promo, there was a realism to it. The only realism in 2002 to 2004 was in the ring matches where there was blood and it was a bit more violent, and in that sense, but they were still doing some of that, with Wade Barrett versus Randy Orton, and other matches were very similar. But the CM Punk thing had a bit of realism in the sense that what he was saying seemed true, and when you look at the real behind the scenes story, it really was. What he was saying about Vince McMahon and John Cena and other people, he really meant it, and he really felt like it. And then later there was a lawsuit between him and WWE and all this stuff. So that to me was fascinating, when you kind of meld the real with the story. And so CM Punk became one of my favorite characters, and, well, the storyline involved with him along the way. And also the idea of, okay, John Cena has been the top guy for many years, and CM Punk, who was a heel, after that speech, suddenly the crowd loved him, and the crowd started booing John Cena when he would come in as the good guy. And I thought, this is interesting. And I thought maybe one day John Cena will turn heel, and I thought, maybe who's going to be the next John Cena? And I started to wonder about that. And I thought, naturally, maybe CM Punk would be the next John Cena. Along the way, Daniel Bryan in 2011, as I mentioned before, was kind of boring. I remember he won the Money in the Bank, and then he ended up winning the heavyweight championship in SmackDown, and he had feuds with the Big Show and Mark Henry and Sheamus, and somehow was able to beat all those guys. This little guy, and I was kind of annoyed by that at first, but then I realized in the ring, I started to get intrigued by Daniel Bryan's in-ring performances, where he didn't fight like Rey Mysterio or Sin Cara, which I enjoyed those styles of most of the small, fighters. But Daniel Bryan had a different style. He fought like a big man in a little man's body. And the way he would run around in there and put all his emotion into it, I started to get intrigued by that. And when he turned in his Money in the Bank and won, and started doing the yes thing. He was like a typical nice, baby face. And then all of a sudden he becomes kind of this spoiled brat heel, and he's like taunting with the yes chants, which becomes kind of the crowd would start doing the yes chants as well. And I thought he became one of the most interesting heels I'd ever seen. He was another one of those guys like Kurt Angle that I couldn't imagine as a bad guy, but he became a very good bad guy. And then when he finally lost the belt, he started doing the no chants, and the audience would still do yes. And this began one of my favorite storylines ever. Him and Kane and anger management and the team Hell No. And Daniel Bryan as kind of the bad guy, and Kane was kind of the baby face. So you had a baby face and a heel as a tag team, and it was one of the funniest. The anger management guy, whoever the leader was of that, was so funny. That whole thing was one of my favorite parts of the show, along with CM Punk and others that were really interesting. And I really was enjoying the shows at this time. So there were several characters that bored me: Cody Rhodes, Jack Swagger, Dolph Ziggler, and I can't think of a lot of them right now. But I will say that Dolph Ziggler and Jack Swagger, who were kind of a team for a while, had one of my favorite managers ever, which was Vicky Guerrero. Her really annoying voice, she was kind of up to that level of a Paul Heyman to me, just an awesome character. Now, the development of the Authority was another great storyline. Triple H, Stephanie McMahon, who sort of became more in charge instead of Vince McMahon. And of course, they were fighting against CM Punk, and that was all interesting. And the development of the Shield, which sort of they worked for justice, and they were kind of the heels at the time, working for the WWE and for the Authority, sort of, and became one of my favorite teams. When I look back to the early teams that I in 2011 that I remember were like Nexus and the Core. I don't really have strong memories. There was nothing that exciting about those groups to me, but of course, maybe if I had watched in 2010, I would have been more into it. But the Shield was great, and just the whole storyline of the Authority being evil, and CM Punk fighting against them, and that sort of built towards when Daniel Bryan was a heel and then started to really get over. To me, he started to get over with the Team Hell No thing. The whole anger management and all that really made me a huge fan. And then afterwards, the crowds really started to get into him somewhere around 2013, and he began to work his way towards the top. And of course, it was the Authority that kept holding him down. And all of that was great storytelling, in my opinion. And also a mixture of authenticity, because I began to learn one of the interesting things about professional wrestling, unlike any other entertainment form, is how the audience can impact the how certain characters are pushed or held down or what have you. And because of the audience, Daniel Bryan was put into the WWE Championship match at a WrestleMania in 2014. But the storyline was not heading that direction. It just so happened that the audience began to hijack the shows. The Royal Rumble before that, uh, people kept chanting Daniel Bryan. There was this, the audience just made it clear who they wanted. And so that began to become part of the storyline. The Authority kept saying, he's a B plus player, he's not championship material, blah blah blah. So that started to become part of it, which I think, in a sense, that's what they thought of him, you know. But because the audience got so much behind him, that it pushed him into the championship picture. And so I found all that very interesting. The next group that was developed was the Wyatt family, and probably to this day my favorite group. Just the weirdness of them and how they were built up. But I feel like in the long run they didn't really, they kind of ruined that group in the sense of they kept burying them. And in my mind, they should have become the biggest, some of the biggest stars, like the next, Undertaker type getting pushed. It just seems so obvious to me, and yet whenever they would have a big match, they would lose. And it really came to a head in 2015 when they were feuding against Undertaker and Kane, these two 50-year-olds, and somehow Undertaker and Kane got over on the Wyatt family, and I thought that was ridiculous. Number one, the Wyatt family is this younger group that you're trying to build for the future, and they were outnumbered Undertaker and Kane, and yet Undertaker and Kane won anyway. Another character in the Wyatt family that was talked about but we never see is Sister Abigail. And I felt like they missed an opportunity there to create this female monster, kind of like a female dead man, like Undertaker, except on the women's side, that would come in and dominate. Now, at the time, I began thinking this around back in 2014, 15, because they would, Bray Wyatt would talk about Sister Abigail, and at that time, the women's division was still kind of weak. It was the Divas division, and there was some moments in there like Nikki Bella was pretty good, and there was some other characters, but for the most part, the women's division was pretty weak. But I thought, with the development of Charlotte Flair and Becky Lynch and Sasha Banks, and you really started to have a strong women's division, if you brought in a Sister Abigail character who would dominate for a while, I would have really been intrigued by that, but they didn't. They never did create that. To me, that would have been an obvious, entertaining thing if they did it right. Another one of my favorite characters was Damien Sandow, who began to really get over with the crowd. This intellectual savior of the masses, which I thought was a great character. And if they had written and had some creativity, they could have done some wonderful things there. But then when he was with The Miz and became the stunt double, I felt like that was awesome. That was so funny. He was so good, and he got really over with the crowd. But unlike Daniel Bryan, they never really gave him the push that the crowd was asking for. And I can't remember what year that was, but I feel like after that, he should have started a feud with The Miz and gotten over on The Miz, who is also one of my favorite characters. I He was kind of boring to me at first, but he really became one of my favorite heels, and I think he made a comeback in the last 5 years where he really started to become a much better heel. But his tag team with Dean Ambrose or with Damien Sandow was great, and it was another one of these, a babyface and a heel that were tag teaming together, which, kind of like the Kane and Daniel Bryan tag team. So I felt like he should have had a feud with The Miz, gotten over, and then gotten towards the top championship belt. And it was just one of those opportunities that I feel like they missed. Now, I don't know how long he would have uh, been able to stay with that momentum if he even had that. But I feel like if you are getting that over, that you should get that push. And one of the things I've noticed is that oftentimes the writers or the WWE would have an idea of what they think a top championship or the face of the company needs to look like, and they push somebody to the ground because this gives us our best chance to somebody to be a celebrity outside of wrestling. And part of that I understand, part of it I don't. you could see it was pretty obvious that Roman Reigns was their guy. He was going to be their next John Cena come hell or high water. When the Shield broke up, I felt like during the Shield, the weak point of the Shield was Seth Rollins. He seemed like kind of the weakest of the three, and I wasn't really sure how they would do it. And I felt like they did a great job making Seth Rollins kind of this cheating heel, Roman Reigns a strong, and Dean Ambrose were baby faces. Dean Ambrose was actually my favorite of those three, but I did enjoy what they were doing with Seth Rollins, and I do enjoy Roman Reigns. But when it becomes pretty obvious that the fans are not behind Roman Reigns, to me, it doesn't mean that he couldn't be the guy down the line, but I felt like the natural thing to do at that point would have been to turn him heel, to make Roman Reigns one of the top heels in the company. And then eventually maybe he would win over the crowd and become a babyface. But sometimes they would follow along with what seemed right, like making Daniel Bryan the champion, making CM Punk the champion. But other times they would push Roman Reigns as trying to make him the next John Cena when the fans were not into it, instead of turning him heel. And then somebody like a Damian Sandow, who was really getting over with the crowd, they would bury, and then suddenly he was cut, which I think was a horrible decision. This isn't just about my opinion. I loved Bo Dallas, but Bo Dallas never really got over with the crowd as much. He never really had that opportunity. So in this period of time, and I think around 2016, I started to get bored again because it was way too obvious what they wanted to do and what the crowd wanted, and everything became a bit too formulaic, and so I've kind of lost interest. But a couple things I forgot to mention of this period was Brock Lesnar's return, and of course I loved that because he was my favorite back in 2002. And unfortunately, I had recorded the episode and accidentally skipped forward to the point when Brock was already in the ring. And I was bummed out about that because I like surprises. I would have loved it when John Cena was out there asking for The Rock to come out and he wanted to shake his hand after losing to him at WrestleMania. Instead, it was Brock Lesnar. And I wish I would have been surprised instead of accidentally skipping forward. And that moment was ruined for me. But Brock Lesnar has become, and of course, the guy that defeated Undertaker in WrestleMania. Everyone, a lot of people seem to hate that, but I think it was a great way to build Lesnar as a top heel. And I think for a few years that was a great story. Brock Lesnar is this dominant heel, but I think they've overstayed that welcome. So anyway, it's getting a little long here, but this video has been about my second time that I was a fan, and it was a bit longer than the first. And in the third video, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the direction I think they should have gone in 2000, after 2015 when I started getting bored, and the stars that I think should have been at the top, and maybe some storyline ideas that I had.